Good evening, everybody. My name is Mel from SAPMIA, and welcome to tonight's education session, Blinded by Sugar, which has been funded by Country PHN. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional owners of this country. We pay tribute to their physical and spiritual connection to the land, waters, and community, enduring now as it has been throughout time. We pay respect to them, their culture, and to elders past and present. Just a few housekeeping points before I introduce our presenter tonight. If you require technical assistance with Zoom, please see the link to the frequently asked questions in the chat feature. Your microphones will be on mute during the webinar. However, we encourage you to be involved by submitting your comments and questions through the Q&A feature. Dr. Muecke will have a Q&A session at the end of his presentation. There will be an evaluation form at the end of the webinar, and your certificates of attendance will be sent out electronically following tonight's session. Delivering tonight's education session is Dr. James Muecke. Dr. Muecke is an ophthalmologist and the 2020 Australian of the Year. He has dedicated his career to fight blindness in the world's low-income countries, and he now shifts his focus to increase awareness about the leading cause of blindness in adults, type 2 diabetes, a spiralling epidemic that's impacting nearly 1 in 10 Australians. Join Dr. Muecke in this webinar where he will challenge your perception of sugar and the impact it has in the development of type 2 diabetes. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Muecke.
Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you so much to SAPMIA and to PHN Country SA for funding tonight and making this possible. And thanks to all my colleagues for joining in. So I'll just go ahead and share the screen now so we can get started. So I've been an ophthalmologist now for 30 years, and for 30 years I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eyes. Every year, I'm seeing more and more patients who are losing vision, even going blind due to diabetes, in particular type 2 diabetes, which makes up about 90% of cases, and is a largely preventable dietary disease related to the consumption of too much sugar in our modern diet. Can you begin to imagine waking up one morning completely blind? It's impossible to comprehend, isn't it? One of my patients has had exactly that experience. His name is Neil Hansell, an everyday Aussie bloke with a wife and 4 kids. He constructs light machinery for a living, and he also has type 2 diabetes. And a few years ago, at the age of 50, diabetes changed Neil's world forever. Unfortunately, he'd neglected his disease, and he paid the price. He went to bed one evening with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes. One of my colleagues worked really hard to try and retrieve his sight. Unfortunately, it was too late. He was to spend the rest of his life in darkness. This is how Neil sees the world these days.
Basically, I think I would describe it as seeing everything as emotion, not as an actual vision. The images, unfortunately, aren't clear. The images are basically what you see of a day through your eyes is what you see of a night through your eyes. So there's no clarity. I see black figures as people or animals or trees, just black onto a greyish background.
Neil lost his driving licence. He lost his independence, and he lost his ability to teach the javelin, which was his hobby. In fact, it was a passion that gave him incredible joy. The thing that upsets Neil the most is that he can no longer see the beautiful smiles on the faces of his wife and grandkids. This is a picture of Neil's wife and 2 of his grandkids. This is how he should see them, and this is the reality. Neil has been irreversibly blinded by sugar. And Neil is not alone. He's just one of over 100,000 Aussies with sight-threatening eye disease due to diabetes. So how does diabetes threaten the sight? Well, as we know, it damages the blood vessels throughout the body, including the retina. This is a picture of the macula, the central vision area of the retina in a patient with type 2 diabetes. And this is that same eye a short time later. Diabetes can cause bleeding inside the eyes. It can take away the eyesight in an instant and sometimes permanently. The important point here is that nearly all of the loss of vision and blindness due to diabetes, something in the order of 98%, is preventable or treatable. And yet, to avoid the blinding consequences of this disease, patients with diabetes need to have their eyes checked on a regular basis. Of the 1.7 million Aussies with this disease, more than half are not having their regular, all-important, sight-saving eye checks. And that's why it's now the leading cause of blindness amongst working-age adults in this country. It's also the fastest growing cause of vision loss in Aboriginal people. So for me, as an eye specialist, to see people going needlessly blind as a result of their diabetes, it makes me upset. The thing that makes me really angry is that this should not be happening at all, this disease. Type 2 diabetes was virtually non-existent in the 60s. In these days, we're seeing about 160 new cases in Australia every single day. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about type 2 diabetes, how it's arisen, why it's a growing epidemic, and I'm also going to look at some strategies to curb this rising tide of the disease that's a serious threat to our society and to our health system. Now, I mentioned before that type 2 diabetes is a largely preventable dietary disease related to the consumption of too much sugar in our modern diet. And when we talk about sugar, we often think of table sugar, sucrose, what we stir in our coffee and tea. But it's really important to remember that there are many other types of sugar and a very abundant form of sugar, the refined carbohydrates, products such as white flour, white rice, white potatoes, and the foods made from these. These are all virtually pure starch, and starch are simply long chains of glucose which break down into single molecules of glucose when they reach the gut. So when you're ingesting refined carbohydrates, you're pretty much ingesting pure sugar. And it's really important to realize that sugar and carbohydrates are actually, or refined carbohydrates, are nutrient poor and not essential to life. The body, there's no biochemical process within the body that demands that we ingest sugar and carbohydrates. And our Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, which is based on Australian dietary guidelines, is packed with products which contain refined carbohydrates, in particular white rice, a variety of white breads and pastas, and white potatoes. And on this guide, there are also a number of products which have a relatively high level of sugar: tropical fruits, low-fat dairy, baked beans, and highly processed foods. So let's return to sucrose. So sucrose is made up of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. And the body handles each of these two molecules in an entirely different way. So let's look at them each in turn. So firstly, glucose. When glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream, as we know, it triggers the release of the hormone insulin from the pancreas, and it helps move that glucose into every cell of our body where it's either stored or used as an energy source. When I talk about glucose metabolism, I like to use the analogy of a subway train in Tokyo, where the train cart is the cell, the passenger, the glucose molecules, and the conductor is the insulin. With prolonged and excessive glucose intake, the cell becomes full and the insulin level increases to try and push more glucose into that cell. But it gets to a stage where it can't push any more in, and we become what's called insulin resistant. And then we have an overflow of glucose into the bloodstream, and this is then taken up by the liver and initially converted into glycogen where it's stored. But the glycogen stores are limited, and so the liver then starts turning the glucose into fat, which is exported away from the liver and stored in healthy fat cells throughout the body. It's actually a type of protective mechanism. But when the production of fat by the liver outstrips its ability to be exported away, the liver then starts to take on the fat, and we then develop what's called a fatty liver. Now, we all know what a normal healthy liver looks like. It's a deep dark red color. You can see that this liver is yellow because it's suffused with fat. Now, a great example of a fatty liver comes from the French culinary delicacy foie gras, which is created by force-feeding geese refined carbohydrates in the form of high-starch cornmeal. And these unsuspecting creatures, a fatty liver can develop within a 10 to 14-day period. In humans with excessive fructose intake, a fatty liver can develop in less than 2 months. So let's look at fructose. Fructose is that molecule of sugar which gives sugary food their sweet flavor. It's not recognized as a food by the body. It doesn't trigger the release of insulin. It actually suppresses our appetite control. And when it's absorbed into the bloodstream, 100% is taken up by the liver, and about 30%, about a third, is actually converted directly into fat. So it's actually far more toxic than glucose and giving rise to a fatty liver. So this is a picture of a normal healthy liver. You can see the densely packed cells here. And here is a fatty liver. You can see it's distended in those white spaces of the cells, which are full of fat. Now, type 2 diabetes can develop on average 13 years after the development of insulin resistance in a fatty liver. In children, type 2 diabetes can actually develop within a couple of years. So what happens, and it's a complex metabolic process, is that the liver stores of fat eventually become saturated and it can't take any more in. So the liver exports the fat away as triglyceride, which is harmful to our body. And it's the high triglyceride level combined with the high insulin level, which leads to the formation of the fatty plaques, which then block our arteries. And this in turn leads to the many life-changing and life-threatening consequences of this disease. I'm sure we all know the myriad of complications that this disease causes. So blockage of the fine blood vessels in the body can lead to numbness, tingling, and pain in the hands and feet. It can lead to impotence. And as I mentioned before, it can cause loss of vision and blindness. As well as causing bleeding inside the eye, we can also see macular edema. And this is an OCT scan through the left and right eye of a patient with type 2 diabetes. You can see the right eye at the top of the page, and the scan looks flat and looks good. Down below that, you can see that little area of swelling at the fovea. So this patient has macular edema secondary to their type 2 diabetes due to damage to the fine foveal blood vessels or perifoveal blood vessels. And such an eye needs to be treated. And these days, the gold standard of treatment is intravitreal injections of anti-VEGF, anti-vascular endothelial growth factor. And just looking at the Medicare numbers of intravitreal injections for macular edema and diabetes, we first started using it in 2016, and you can see it's doubled in the 4 years to 2019. And this really mirrors the growth of type 2 diabetes in our society and the uptake of these injections. I suspect this year we will be topping 100,000 injections. So this is 100,000 injections across the country that really shouldn't even need to be happening. Type 2 diabetes can also cause dementia. Something like 70% of patients will ultimately develop dementia. And so this is a disease that not just impacts on the individual, it also impacts on patients' loved ones and their families. And of course, one of the severe complications of type 2 diabetes is kidney failure. And we need to filter the blood when this happens. So renal dialysis is necessary, sometimes up to 7 hours a day, 4 days a week. And I've calculated in Australia, every single year, there are 4.5 million hours spent by patients with type 2 diabetes hooked up to the dialysis machine. 4.5 million hours. Isn't that staggering? That's time lost to family and friends, to their work, and to the things that they love to do. Now, blockage of the major blood vessels is quite devastating, and it can lead to gangrene of the feet. This is a gangrenous foot in a patient with type 2 diabetes. It's the second most feared complication after loss of eyesight. And of course, such a foot needs to be amputated. Every year in Australia, over 4,000 amputations are performed for patients with type 2 diabetes. And here's our friend, Neil Hansell, in hospital after his left leg was amputated in March this year. It was in fact his 9th amputation in a 14-month period after he went blind in both eyes. Neil has also had 2 heart attacks, 2 silent heart attacks. So this is also a deadly disease. In fact, 80% of patients with type 2 will die of a thrombotic complication such as heart attack or stroke. It's now said to be the 6th biggest killer in our society. But if we realize that type 2 plays a role in the top 3 killers being heart attack, dementia, stroke, then I suspect type 2 diabetes could be the biggest killer in our midst. And if we look at the current situation in the COVID pandemic, in the first few months, there were about 102 deaths in Australia due to COVID-19. Tragic deaths, absolutely. But in the same time period, over 5,000 deaths due to type 2 diabetes, which went pretty much unheralded. This is also a really expensive disease, costing our health system close to $20 billion every single year for treatment of diabetes, its complications, and lost productivity in the workforce. But if we also factor in the complications of diabetes, heart attack, stroke, dementia, also its linkages to cancer, hypertension, I suspect the cost is many multiples higher than this, probably closer to 100 billion every year. So how did this all arise? Well, humans are hardwired to love and seek out sweet things. It's an ancient survival mechanism that helped our early ancestors to survive extended periods of fasting, which were common in early humans. Prior to the 1600s, sugar was an expensive commodity. It was the domain of healers and holy men, and an indulgence that could only be afforded by the wealthy and powerful. Over the next 300 years, the rising availability and popularity of sugar due to the booming sugar trade led to diminishing costs, turning sugar from a luxury item to an everyday necessity. These days, sugar is cheap, and sugar is absolutely everywhere. And things took a turn for the worst in 1980 when the dietary guidelines for Americans was released. It was noted in the decades after World War II, there was a rise in heart attack. And it was thought that this was due to a fatty diet, giving rise to fatty blockage of the coronary arteries. And on no strong scientific evidence, the recommendation was to reduce our fat to 30% and increase our carbohydrates to 60%. And rather than seeing a downturn of heart attack, heart disease soared, along with it, type 2 diabetes. In fact, in the past 40 years, there's been a fourfold increase globally in type 2 diabetes. And this has been more profound in some communities and countries. In China, for example, there's been more than a tenfold increase in type 2 diabetes since 1980. And this is somewhat paradoxical because the Chinese diet is high in refined carbohydrates in the form of white rice. But what we've noted in Asia in recent years is the rising sugar consumption, which is amounting to about 5% every single year. In the Aboriginal people of Australia, there's been an 80-fold increase in type 2 diabetes. And I have no doubt that a diet that's high in sugar, refined carbohydrates, and highly processed foods is driving this. And if we look at the Guide to Healthy Eating for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we can see the same products high in sugar, refined carbohydrates, and highly processed foods. And you may even recognize some clearly obvious products which are labeled there. And there are some lower socioeconomic groups in Australia where this is really impacting severely. And you can see in Greater Western Sydney, the red areas are the areas of the highest prevalence of type 2 diabetes. In fact, in Greater Western Sydney, half of adults over the age of 24 have either type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes for the first time in history. In fact, in America, more than half actually, of adults in the United States have type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. I find that deeply concerning and absolutely staggering. And something that I find equally staggering is that we're now seeing type 2 diabetes in children throughout the world. In Australia, there are 1,138 Aussie kids and teens with type 2 diabetes. This is a worldwide phenomenon. In 2001, less than 3% of all new cases of diabetes were due to type 2. And within a 10-year period, this grew to nearly half. And things only continue to get worse. There are now close to 40,000 people in the age 21 to 39 with type 2 diabetes in Australia. And it's been predicted that leading up to 2030, there'll be a loss of $3 billion of GDP due to type 2 diabetes. And just as a little bring back to reality, there's even been a 3-year-old girl in the UK diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a little girl that had a diet which was high in consumption of sugary drinks. And we've seen in Australia children as young as 7 with type 2 diabetes. So what are we going to do about this? Well, if we're going to call this a dietary disease, then there should be a dietary cure. It should be as simple as reducing the sugar intake, or excessive sugar intake, and reducing the intake of refined carbohydrates and highly processed foods. Now, it should be that easy, but there are a number of factors which make it a more difficult thing to achieve. And I call these the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. And these are addiction, alleviation, accessibility, addition, and advertising. And I'll go through these just briefly each in turn. So firstly, addiction. Sugar is highly addictive. It's been shown to be as addictive as nicotine. This consumption activates a reward center in our brains, leading to the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. It's what makes us feel good. It's what makes us want to do it again. And it's what gives us those cravings. And like drugs, the more we consume, the more we need to give us that feel-good hit. So it becomes a vicious cycle that's really hard to break. The second A is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress and to make us feel better when we're down. When we're stressed, the body is flooded with the stress hormone cortisol, and the brain needs to balance this up by the release of feel-good chemicals such as dopamine, and sugar does a really good job of that. The third A is accessibility. As I mentioned before, sugar is cheap and sugar is absolutely everywhere. You can't even walk into a service station these days without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. And you can't check out from those supermarkets and stores without being enticed by sugary food and drinks. 90% of all food at Australian checkouts is discretionary junk food, and 30% of that is on sale in any one week in the major supermarket chains in Australia. Fourth A is addition. An astronomical amount of sugar is added to our food and drink, something in the order of 75%. And this is particularly problematic in remote communities where sugary food and drinks are in abundance and cheap. Fresh and healthy foods are scarce and often quite expensive. And the final A is advertising. Our world is flooded with ads and TV commercials for sugary products, often in the most insidious of ways. This has been going on, quite literally, for decades. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, to me, it's going to take resilience. And when I talk about resilience, I like to use the analogy of Mr. Spock from Star Trek. He's a very cool-headed and resilient character, isn't he? And I know what he'd do. He'd look to the smoking epidemic to see what's causing its decline. Back when Spock first graced our screen in the 50s, smoking was socially acceptable. In the years after World War II, something like 80% of men smoked cigarettes. And look at this ad for candy cigarettes from the 50s and the caption on the cigarette packet, just like Dad. The realization of the health dangers of smoking in the 60s and the subsequent banning of advertising for cigarettes, the taxing of tobacco products, and the rollout of hard-hitting awareness strategies such as these have all made smoking socially unacceptable. And as a result, smoking and smoking-related diseases and deaths are on the decline in most countries. Not so sugar consumption, type 2 diabetes, and its complications, which are on the rise. So we're going to need to engage the same resilient approach to dealing with the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. So let's go through those again. So for addiction and alleviation, it's about being aware, personally aware of how addictive sugar is and how we're using it to alleviate stress. And for the other 3 A's, it's about accountability of businesses, industry, and of government to do the right thing by the people of Australia. So let's look at these each in turn. So firstly, addiction. I suspect that much of the world is addicted to sugar. I certainly was, and probably still am. The thing that I love the most is ice cream. The bigger, the better. The worst punishment I could receive as a child when I was a kid was to be sent to my bed after dinner without ice cream. And there's rarely been a day since when I haven't enjoyed a bowl of this creamy treat. But I got a shock earlier in the year when I found on a scan that I have the beginnings of a fatty liver. I'm metabolically unhealthy. And here's my fatty liver. Now I'm what they call toffee, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. I'm certainly not overweight. I didn't realize I had a problem. And this is the problem. There are now more thin, unhealthy people, metabolically unhealthy people, than there are obese, metabolically unhealthy people. This is a stats from the United States, but I suspect Australia is in exactly the same boat. So I'm not wanting to be hardline about this. I still want to be able to go out to dinner and enjoy a delicious dessert. I still want to receive a Haig's mint chocolate frog for my birthday. And I still want to be able to have an ice cream, just not every night. So for me, it was a physical dependency. And when I found out I had a fatty liver, I immediately went into a sugar detox. I gave up the heavily sugared products in my diet, the soft drinks and fruit juices, cake and biscuits, the chocolate and confectioneries, and absolutely the ice cream. And immediately it gave me withdrawal symptoms: headache, fatigue, irritability, clouded thoughts. It was worse than a coffee withdrawal, and the cravings were really intense. And over the next few days, the symptoms built up, and it wasn't until day 3 or after day 3 when they started to ease off. And these days I can walk past the freezer without having to leap in and grab an ice cream. So this physical dependency is pretty tough to kick. But if you're deeply addicted, we may need to engage helplines, self-help groups, psychological counselling, as we've done for nicotine and alcohol addiction. So second A is alleviation. Rather than reaching for a block of chocolate or another 2-litre bottle of soft drink when you're feeling down, there are a lot more healthy options. You can go for a walk out in nature, somewhere beautiful, or a run or a cycle. Listen to your favourite musical playlist. Reach out to someone else who's having a tough time. Do a good deed. These have all been shown to be as effective as sugar in countering that cortisol reaction that's flooding the body during anxious times. Third A is accessibility, and there are a number of strategies here. This is the vending machines just this week at the Women's and Children's Hospital here in Adelaide. And I've written to the Women's and Children's Hospital actually some weeks ago, and this process to remove the sugary products from vending machines is a really difficult thing to achieve. This is 2 vending machines in the study area of the Adelaide Medical and Dental School, our bastion of health. Once again, I've written to the Dean. In fact, I've written to all of the universities asking them to remove the sugary products from vending machines. At this point in time, I've only had a positive response from UniSA. And one of the obvious things is to remove the sugary products from checkout counters, where they're preying on our addiction, they're preying on the vulnerable, and they're absolutely preying on our children. Now, I've written to every single one of these businesses, and I've met with Coles and Woolworths. And at this point in time, I've only had a positive response from Australia Post. There is absolutely no incentive to give up the sugary products at these checkout counters. I was delighted to see, however, at the Norwood Foodland, one of the checkouts had been dismantled and changed to packets of nuts. So this is the sort of thing that would be great to see across the board in all the supermarkets and stores across the country. Fourth A is addition. I don't know about you, but I can barely read those nutritional labels on the packets of our foods, let alone understand them. And they certainly don't tell us the amount of added sugar contained within. We have a health star rating system, which is flawed. It's flawed because it's voluntary, and only about 30% of businesses put the system on foods that they're selling. What manufacturer would put a unhealthy rating on a product that they're trying to sell? And there are a number of unhealthy products that get a healthy rating, and orange juice is one of these. A glass of orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of cola. And I really want to see graphic fronted pack labeling telling us how much sugar is contained within these products. And this is where the contentious issue of taxing sugary products comes in, but there is some good evidence and solid reasoning behind it. In Australia, in the 10 years leading up to 2017, sugary drink consumption increased by 30%. And sugary drink consumption has been linked to type 2 diabetes in many studies. And a levy on sugary drinks has shown to reduce purchase and consumption in 17 different countries. So it makes sense to me. And it's been modelled in Australia that a 20% levy on sugary drinks would raise over $600 million, which could then be used to fund health awareness initiatives and health inequalities that exist in our society. So finally, advertising. And again, there are a number of strategies here. One of the obvious ones would be to remove TV commercials for sugary products from TV when our kids are watching during those hours when our kids are in front of the TV. Removing ads for sugary products from government buildings and services such as buses and trams. And we need a strategy, a far-reaching strategy to raise awareness amongst the Australian public of the multitude of health dangers of excessive sugar consumption, not just type 2 diabetes, but also dental caries. Sugar is the leading cause of tooth decay in our society. It's the leading cause of surgical admission for kids and days lost at school. But we also need to see and hear some positive messages that type 2 diabetes is a preventable disease and it's a reversible disease. This is something that's critical, that's not known widely, even by my medical colleagues. But there are now over 100 controlled clinical trials to support that a low-carb diet can actually reverse type 2 diabetes. And here's just one example. In a 10-week period, 56% of patients with type 2 diabetes were able to reverse their disease by using a low-carb diet. And our Australian dietary guidelines are way overdue for an overhaul. They are outdated and flawed and heavily conflicted by industry influence. And our guidelines are very powerful. They inform what's eaten in schools, childcare, aged care, hospitals, the Defence Force and prisons. They also inform health providers such as yourself, health educators, government policymakers, and the food industry, and they've led to the production of literally thousands of low-fat products. Even Diabetes Australia on its website says that people with diabetes should follow the Australian dietary guidelines. They're advising that people with type 2 diabetes have the very high-carb diet that's absolutely making their condition worse. And the guidelines themselves say that they're intended for the average healthy person. Now, we don't need guidelines for healthy Aussies, but we do need guidelines for unhealthy Aussies. And we need to be encouraged to, or actually this is the other really important, absolutely critical factor, that the natural saturated dietary fats have never been linked to cardiovascular disease. Foods such as what you see here on the screen, but also whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, even dark chocolate, are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. This is the latest release from the American College of Cardiology in June this year. Absolutely critical information that we as medical practitioners need to understand. We need to encourage our patients to eat real food, food such as this, without labels, without packaging. We need to minimize our ingestion of the highly processed, highly sugary, discretionary junk food. And what we do need to see are hard-hitting awareness strategies to raise awareness of the multitude of complications which await people with type 2 diabetes that many of them are not aware of. I'm now going to play you a TV commercial that I created for Siteful back in 2018.
I should have kept my medication up and I should have followed the plans that were given to me by my doctors. I woke up one morning completely blind. Thought I was dreaming, went back to sleep for an hour, woke up and I was still completely blocked off. My wife's face when we went to bed. That was the last clear image I had.
It's a heart-wrenching 30 seconds, isn't it? That TV commercial played for 6 weeks in late 2018, nationally on Channel 7. But we need to see such ads across all channels during prime time and for extended periods. To me, it's all about education. These days, would you leave a pack of cigarettes on the kitchen counter for your kids to enjoy? Absolutely not. So why would you leave a bowl of sugary treats? You need to exchange that bowl of sugary treats for a bowl of nuts, for example. We need to educate our kids. And yet we can't educate our kids until we know and understand ourselves. And how about those soft drinks in our fridge? Perhaps this is their gloomy future. Perhaps soft drinks, like smoking, we need to make socially unacceptable. I'm now going to leave you with one last message from Neil Hansell from his hospital bed the day after his left leg was amputated due to his type 2 diabetes.
I had a little joke the other day and I put my hand up and I had a grain of sugar between my fingers and I said, meet my killer. And people were trying to see what was in my fingers and all it was 1 grain of salt, 1 grain of sugar. And that's what it takes. You know, as a society, we have to do something. We've got to make people aware that the more sugar we intake, the worse this is going to get. And it's not good. It's not good.
It's not good, is it? As an eye specialist, I never want to see another patient going needlessly blind due to their diabetes. As doctors, we should not be seeing the life-changing and life-threatening complications of a dietary disease that shouldn't be happening in the first place. And as Australians, I truly believe it's time to put an end to type 2 diabetes. Thank you very much. Before I stop sharing my screen, I'm just going to leave you with this one last slide. This is just a series of social media handles. If you're interested in following Sight for All, subscribing to our newsletter, you can do that on the homepage of our website, and we have a number of social media handles there. And for those of you who want to follow me as Australian of the Year during this very important year and also the year beyond, then there are a number of social media handles there. I've also put them in the chat line, so if you're interested, you can copy those, and I'd be very delighted for you to follow me. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, and there may well be some questions. I have no doubt there'll be some questions. So thank you once again for joining me today. Mel, are you coming back on?
Yes, I am. So everybody, Dr. Muecke would love to hear from you. We have a Q&A function just towards the bottom of your screen. If you could please just submit your questions through there, he'd like to answer them for you. I do have one that came through from Randy, and his question was, do you have authors or books that you would recommend that discuss the problem of the flawed dietary guidelines advocating high carbs and low fat diets for all diabetic and non-diabetic alike?
Yeah, I don't know if there's any books as such talking about this, because this is just something that's evolving at the moment. There is an online platform called michaelwest.com. Michael West is a journalist, and there are some very interesting articles written by an investigative journalist. Her name is Marianne Damasi. So that's certainly worth looking at. And I've also, if you follow me, you'll see I've written quite a number of opinion pieces which have gone out through the ACM media channel. It's Canberra Times and about 17 regional publications. But if you go to my Facebook page and Instagram sites, you'll see, and my LinkedIn site, you'll see some connections through to my opinion pieces. And I'm about to. There was a piece that I wrote about the dietary guidelines a couple of months ago, and Greg Hunt literally that week came out saying that they were going to review the guidelines. I've been lobbying and pushing the NHMRC and the Department of Health for some weeks to review the dietary guidelines, and I was delighted to see that they're going to be reviewed. So that was certainly really pleasing to see. And I'm going to be releasing another opinion piece in the coming weeks, just going into more detail about the dietary guidelines. So I don't think you'll find too much out there about the dietary guidelines, but those of you who are interested, which we should all be, in fact, I believe at the moment, we are being irresponsible, if not negligent, by not offering the ability for type 2 diabetic patients to reverse their diabetes through a low-carb diet. And there are a number of ways you can explore this. Virta, V-I-R-T-A, Virta Health in the United States offers solutions. Diabetes.co.uk is the UK equivalent. And Sugar by Half, which is Peter Bruckner's platform, is about to release a similar thing here in Australia. So there are certainly great opportunities to get this information and choose wisely the dietitians who can help with this low carb process. So I think it's really, really critical for us as medical practitioners to be aware of it. Me, as an eye specialist, I only saw myself as treating the complications, the blinding complications of this disease. And I did not and have not ever, in 30 years, given my patients dietary advice. I'm still not giving them dietary advice, but I'm suggesting to my patients to go back to their GPs and at least discuss this possibility. In recent weeks, I've actually asked every single one of my type 2 diabetic patients, are you aware that you can reverse your type 2 diabetes? Not a single one was aware of it. As I mentioned in the presentation, over 100 clinical control trials, which strong evidence that this works. And there are plenty of anecdotal individual stories of patients who've reversed their type 2 diabetes even 10 years down the track. Unfortunately, we won't always be able to reverse some of the damage that's been done in terms of the complications, but I think we should be giving them every opportunity to do this. Now, Mel, if there's any other questions, I'm happy for you to read them out for me.
Fantastic. Randy has also asked, so is the low carb and high fat diet the same as the ketogenic diet?
No, well, there's a number of different types of diets. There's a low carb diet. Ketogenic diet's a really hardline diet, and really it depends. And this is where, I mentioned before that we don't need guidelines for healthy patients. We need guidelines for unhealthy patients. So we have patients who are insulin resistant, but not pre-diabetic. Pre-diabetic patients, we have patients with type 2 diabetes, and we have patients who are metabolically unhealthy. There are over 2/3 of Australian adults over the age of 24 who are overweight or obese. Over 2/3. I mean, that is absolutely staggering, I find. So the vast majority of us are metabolically unhealthy. So I think the vast majority of us should really be on a low carb diet. I mean, as I mentioned, for me, it was just a matter of giving up the heavily sugared products and being conscious of the refined carbohydrates that I was consuming. I also threw in there a bit of time-restricted eating, a 16/8 fast. So after dinner through to lunchtime the next day, I don't eat. And it's amazing, within a couple of months, I dropped something like 10 kilograms. I wasn't trying to lose weight. And I did this before I even realized I had a fatty liver. So it's amazing how powerful that just minimizing sugar, refined carbohydrates, and fasting can be. Now, if I had type 2 diabetes, I think I would probably, well, if I was pre-diabetic, I'd certainly go a more extensive low carb. And if I had type 2 diabetes, I'd probably go to the keto level. And there is, a famous case of an 85-year-old type 1 patient with type 1 diabetes in the United States who's lived for 75 years on a very low carb stroke ketogenic diet. This was a low carb diet was what we used to treat patients with type 1 diabetes before insulin was invented. So, this is absolutely critical information. We are feeding patients with type 2 diabetes absolutely the wrong thing. And this has been driven by vested interests, vested industry influence, and vested religious influence that we as medical practitioners need to be critically aware of. Thank you for the question.
Wonderful. And from Liz, how as health professionals can we educate against the dietary guidelines? It is very difficult.
Yes, this is the problem, isn't it? That once we have guidelines, people are afraid to go outside of the guidelines. Well, let's hope that the new guidelines will be sensible. I see there's a question about will they be independent? They need to be independent. The Dietitians Association of Australia, now Dietitians Australia, with a group responsible for the literature search and the questions informing the literature search for the last rendition of the guidelines back in 2013. I'm worried that it's going to take probably another 3 years before the guidelines to be reviewed. And in that time, there's going to be perhaps up to 60,000 deaths and in the order of 300,000 new cases of type 2 diabetes. So I've been calling on an awareness campaign, in the meantime, to make Australians aware of it. So it's really, really critical. So you might be aware of the case of Dr. Gary Fettke, who's an orthopedic surgeon from Tasmania, who several years ago was just getting over the fact that he was amputating so many legs. Every week he was amputating gangrenous legs from type 2 diabetes. And so he started looking into the biochemistry and started telling to his patients just to reduce the amount of sugar that they were eating. He was reported by one of the dietitians at the hospital and then had a star chamber investigation which went on for years. He was finally exonerated, but it took its toll. He got a pardon from APRA, and we, as medical practitioners, are now allowed to recommend a low-carb diet to our patients. So I think the more of us that know and advocate for this, the better. Absolutely. We need to all write and just inform our colleagues, talk about this as much as we can. And in the meantime, hopefully we'll see this paradigm shift that's needed in our dietary disaster, I call it.
Fantastic. And from Christine, just touching on what you were saying before, will the dietary guideline review be independent?
That's what I just mentioned, that I'm hoping it will be independent. I'm waiting. So the dietary guideline, the 2013 rendition, and we can talk about this for ages. There are biases at multiple levels, and if we just, for example, take the references in the cereal and grain section, there were 73 references, and of those, 63 were funded by industry. So all but 10 were funded by industry, and we know that when industry funds a study, it's nearly eight times more likely to show a result which is in favour of the industry. So that's just one level of bias, and there are a number of other levels of bias. The questions for the literature review were actually written by the Dietary Association of Australia, who at the time were heavily conflicted by industry. So this absolutely needs to be independently done, and I'm again pushing the NHMRC to have an independent body doing it. But what body can do an impartial review of biased literature? It's a really big problem, and so that's why I'm saying perhaps what we need to do is actually abandon the dietary guidelines for healthy Australians and just use dietary guidelines for unhealthy Australians.
That's fantastic. Is there any further questions at all from our participants tonight? I'll just give everybody another minute or two. Feel free to send through your questions. Dr. Muecke would love to answer them for you. Dr. Muecke, we have one more question from Randy. Are endocrinologists, diabetic specialists on board with this point of view?
There are some, but I think us as medical practitioners, as frontline health practitioners, as general practitioners, as endocrinologists, often not aware of the evidence of the flaws, of the biases that are inherent here. And we continue to follow this mantra that we've heard for the last 40 years, demonizing natural saturated fats, promoting the health benefits of cereals and grains. And I suspect that many are not fully aware, and that's why it's so critical for endocrinologists and all of the people that are involved in the management of this condition aware. We need to start back, and at university, medical students need to be made aware. I don't remember ever receiving any lectures on nutrition, but it's so critical. I mean, this is driving the chronic dietary diseases. So a poor diet is responsible for more disease and death worldwide than inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined. Isn't that an extraordinary thing? A poor diet, and yet as medical students we're not receiving any education about this. So again, critical information that we need to be aware of. We need to make change, and we as doctors just need to keep on pushing. I mean, I have a small social media following, even now as Australian of the Year. Today I can see there's 33 participants. You know, there are thousands of GPs here in South Australia, and there are tens of thousands of GPs around the country that need to know this message. And it's just, we will hear more and more of it. Again, if we look at Low Carb Down Under, which is a really important platform here in Australia, that you can actually find out endocrinologists, cardiologists, dietitians even, who are on board with the low carb message. So I think that that's a really good resource to access people in South Australia. And I know there are low carb dietitians and cardiologists here in Australia and endocrinologists who are absolutely on board with this. And so we need to be aware again of who they are.
Great. Vicky has asked regarding low fat dairy, are we advocating less full fat instead?
No, so as I mentioned before, so full fat dairy, eggs, so full fat dairy cheese, full fat milk, cream, eggs, red meat, unprocessed red meat, all of these things which have been demonized for so long have never been linked to cardiovascular disease. All of the evidence from 40 odd years ago was heavily influenced by the sugar industry, based on flawed science. And there is still to this day, and there's many, many studies that reassure us that they're not bad for our health. And what's interesting, what happened when there was this push to reduce saturated fats, that's when we had this explosion of low-fat products, including low-fat milk. And it's actually been shown in some studies that low-fat milk is actually worse for weight gain than full-fat milk. Yeah. So it's what happens when you actually remove the fat from a product. You need to replace it with something to replace the flavor. So the fat within a food gives rise to, or at least gives a flavor, and also gives us satiety, the ability to make us feel full and replete after a meal. So when you actually remove the fat, you have to replace it with sugar, carbs, and that's one of the things that's really driving our poor health. And so, yeah, really important information to also be aware of, that all of this processed food is heavily sugared. In fact, as I mentioned, 75% of our food and drinks have added sugar. In the UK, over 50% of the food that is ingested is ultra processed. In the United States, something like 62%, and I suspect Australia, we're somewhere in between those two levels. So we are, heading for an even worse dietary disaster. And actually, in the United States, we're now starting to see the longevity curve, which was on the rise, starting to plateau out and even drop. And I suspect in Australia, we're not far behind that.
Wonderful. And from Christine, do you think there will ever be diets prescribed by doctors for type 2 diabetes that will be supported by health funding?
Oh, I don't know, but I think I don't know, because I think the dietitians, yeah, it's not a space I'm completely aware of, but what I think you need here is dietitians and nutritionists who are on board with this very sensible evidence-based practice, health practice, and I suspect it is a bit of a barrier to access good nutritionists and dietitians, because patients often have to pay for that if they're not don't have a health fund coverage. So yeah, it is a problem, and hopefully, as awareness is raised, hopefully as we see this paradigm shift, hopefully we'll see all of this unfolding. And it's quite extraordinary, the amount of money, the $20 billion spent every year. As I said, perhaps many multiples of that, if at least a fraction of that money is put into raising awareness about making healthy and fresh foods, subsidizing these in remote communities and in poorer socioeconomic areas, to subsidize advice from dietitians and nutritionists. All of this will start to then have a flow-on effect into a better health for our society.
Right. And from an anonymous attendee, what is your opinion of the whole foods plant-based diet for the reversal of diabetes?
There's no evidence to show that there's again, this is a long thing. So basically, our dietary guidelines, our dietary pyramid is encouraging a plant-based diet. So something in the order of close to 2/3 of the diet that we're ingesting, that we're recommending, is plant-based. And so the vast majority is carbohydrate. And of that, there's certainly a significant proportion of refined carbohydrates. And if we also look at the processed foods, which fall within that, we have products which are high in sugar and high in refined carbohydrates as well. So a plant-based diet is not a balanced diet. Unfortunately, the saturated fats in meats, eggs, dairy continues to be discouraged on no evidence, as I mentioned before. So this is where I'm saying we need a paradigm shift that comes back to the diet that we were ingesting, a century ago, even 50 years ago, which was a more balanced diet of meat, vegetables, cereals and grains, not this plant-based diet. Whole foods, real foods, absolutely, but balanced up with natural saturated fats, not carb-heavy plant-based.
Fantastic. And is there any more last-minute questions at all for Dr. Muecke? I'll just give everybody a moment, just in case there are any more questions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just reading on the comments there, someone said it's not rocket science. You know, this is second year biochemistry. We all know there is the Krebs cycle. So there's no biochemical process in our body that, as I mentioned before, that demands that we ingest sugar and carbohydrates. So the Krebs cycle doesn't need carbohydrates. They're non-essential. The Krebs cycle can make all the glucose it needs to drive the energy requirements of our bodies through proteins and fats. I'm not saying that we need to have a no-carb diet, because I'm a foodie. I love to have a balanced diet. I love, a variety of foods. But it's just really important to remember that we actually don't need carbs to survive. And this is where, if you're going hardline keto, this is you start to use the Krebs cycle to create all the glucose you need from protein and fat. So it's really important. This is not rocket science. This is biochemistry. So everything that happens within the body is biochemistry. It's unarguable. Everything outside the body is vested interests, flawed science, weak evidence. Really important to remember that.
Great. And Louise has asked, how is toffee diagnosed?
This is the problem, isn't it? I mean, I what I did when I realized I had a fatty liver was I actually had my insulin level. So insulin is the big driver of weight gain. This is really important, again, to know. High blood sugar is really just a symptom of the disease. High blood sugar is not the big bad one. It's the high insulin level, which is the big bad thing. And as I mentioned before, it's a high insulin level combined with a high triglyceride level, which is the big driver of all of the fatty blockage of our arteries. So I actually had my insulin level measured, and my insulin level was fine. So here am I, a thin guy, probably ate too much ice cream, chocolate, soft drinks. I had a pack of cream biscuits most days when I was at work. So I know that my diet wasn't good. I know that I was metabolically unhealthy, but I didn't realize at the time. I had no idea. As a doctor, I had no idea of how addictive it was. I had no idea of how bad it was. The sugar was the big driver of our poor health. So how is Joe Bloggs on the street in poorer socioeconomic areas going to have any idea? So it's a really interesting thing. So we can't go doing liver scans on everyone, can we? Liver ultrasound, we just simply can't do it, because even high insulin level, which will pick up metabolic dysfunction prior to pre-diabetes and certainly prior to type 2 diabetes. I think insulin levels are an expensive thing relative to blood sugar levels. But before that, we need to know that our livers are healthy. And how are we going to do that? As I say, we can't do ultrasound of livers on everyone. And this is where we just need awareness. We need awareness that our diet is driving this. We need awareness that our poor diet, that our dietary guidelines are flawed. We need awareness of, if we continue down this pathway, what are all these myriad of really unpleasant complications that await us? So I think, to me, there's two main overarching factors, as I mentioned before. There's the awareness factor and there's the accountability factor. And there's also the accountability of the government to act and to do the right thing by the people of Australia.
Fantastic. Are there any further questions this evening? Dr. Muecke, is there perhaps anything further you'd like to say to the attendees?
Well, just thank you for joining in. Thanks again to Satmir, to PHN Country SA. Thank you to you, Mel, for facilitating today. And yeah, just go out, be brave, be noisy. Don't fear to tell your patients this. I know, the sort of counselling does take time, for sure. But if you get on board with a dietitian or a nutritionist that realise these critical dietary messages that are not conflicted by industry or religious influence, then I think you can go forward safely. Talk about it widely, talk about it amongst your colleagues, talk about it in your practices. We just need to start talking about this to raise awareness of these really critical issues. So yeah, please join me in this fight. Thank you.
Fantastic. Would like to thank Dr. Muecke for his very informative education session, We're very privileged to have you presenting for us, and we hope that everybody found it valuable and relevant to their practices. Just a reminder that you will be prompted to complete a brief evaluation when you leave this webinar. So please do take the time to do this, as your responses will help us improve future education sessions. SAMIA also have a number of education sessions coming up, so please sign up to our newsletter called Cognitio or visit our website to see what's on offer. Again, thank you, Dr. Muecke, and thank you everybody for your attendance.
Thanks, Mel. Thanks, everyone. All the best.
Have a good night.
See ya.